Welcome back to HTML5 Application Development Fundamentals. I'm Cullen, and we're about to head into Module 4 and start our wonderful voyage into cascading style sheets. Right now, we're going to go ahead and focus on some basics of content flow, positioning, and styling. And let's take a look at the agenda, actually. Talk a little bit about what cascading style sheets are. Talk about their selectors and declarations. Talk a little bit about fonts and font families, then content flow, positioning, and then content overflow, which is very different from content flow, okay? So keep that in mind, all right? Without further ado, cascading style sheets. CSS, or cascading style sheets, is a language that's separate from HTML, and it defines how elements are styled. So in other words, HTML structures a document, CSS formats it. I think of these things as layers. So if maybe if you're building a building, right, HTML would be the foundation, right? So it sits on the bottom. And then you add CSS on top into the exterior because it styles it. Later, we're going to add functionality with another layer called JavaScript, right? And so you can't have one without the other. So you need HTML before you can really apply CSS, and then JavaScript is going to make things move to, typically you're going to apply that after CSS as well, but to each their own on that one. CSS can be applied to single HTML elements, or it can be applied to groups. CSS files are stored as style sheets, and they feature the .css extension here. So you can see up on the screen in this example, whoops, right here, this one is titled example.css, right? Unlike HTML, CSS uses rules instead of tags. So this whole thing right here is a rule, right? That's going to define the style. CSS3 is the version of CSS that was released in conjunction with HTML5. So they're partners in crime. CSS3 is backwards compatible, which means that it can easily be used with older versions of HTML and CSS. There are a couple of exceptions, though. Some older browsers won't properly render HTML that's been styled with CSS3. So do keep that in mind, and we'll touch on that throughout the rest of the presentation. There are a number of new effects in CSS3 as well, including 2D and 3D transformations, and then also animations too. We'll detail all of these wonderful things about the third version of cascading style sheets. First, let's go ahead and talk about how we can link a CSS file with HTML, or how we can just link CSS with HTML, period, right? There are three different ways to do it. So one, we have inline styling, okay? So we have our HTML element, P, and we have the style attribute, and all we're gonna do is we're gonna add something simple like color red, right? That's a declaration. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in terms of the structure of CSS. You're also gonna see me throughout this presentation and others using the style element, which is going to be nested inside of the head tags at the top of an HTML document, right? So we could do it inline with each element. We could add it in as a style element inside of the head tags. And then third, we can link a separate CSS file. This is great if you have large amounts of CSS, and it really is how you should be doing things when you're designing a fully functional website. For our tiny little simple websites, we're probably going to do a lot of number one and number two. But if you create more robust websites, you definitely want to focus on the third way of linking CSS to HTML. Okay. Just to highlight a couple of advantages of placing CSS in a separate file, you can apply a style change to an entire document, or you can work with the team across different web projects, and you can maintain the same style. So I can go ahead and I can share everything that I'm doing in my CSS file with all of my friends who are also building web pages, and then they all use the same style. And that is a really cool thing, and it definitely makes your job a lot easier if you're developing web pages or web applications, okay? All right, let's keep on rolling. So let's talk about that link tag a little bit, okay? CSS files are linked to HTML files using the link element. The link element has an href attribute, which is going to point to the file source for the style sheet. It's really, really important that we make sure that our file name and the location are correct, or else none of our style will be applied. We'll keep getting all those simple little HTML pages that we had that just look real ugly and plain, okay? We're gonna use the rel attribute, set that as style sheet, and then we use the type attribute, we set that as text /CSS. This is the way it's done every single time. The only thing that really should change when you're linking a CSS file is maybe the name of the file itself and its location. All right, so let's go ahead and get started and dive a little bit deeper into selectors and declarations. So there are two different parts of a CSS rule. You have a selector, which could be like H1, it could be P, it could be any element that you want styled on a page, or you could use IDs or classes. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but a selector, right, is going to reference a specific HTML elements or a group of elements. A declaration, which is the whole thing here, right? We had just talked about that with inline styling. A declaration has two parts. It's got a property, which is followed by a colon, and then it's got a space and then a value followed by a semicolon. So here we have the color property is going to be set with a value of red, and that makes our header turn red. Okay. Declarations, they sit between curly braces too, okay? So keep all these things in mind. Definitely review this slide in the future for reference. HTML elements can be referenced by selectors in a number of ways, right? So we had talked about the actual tag name, but we can also use IDs, and we can use class selectors, right? So up here at the top, we've got the tag name with H1. Here, we've got an ID for a nav bar, where we set the background color of our ID as our ID nav bar as green. And then we can also go ahead and use a class, right, and say that everything in our web page that's happy is going to have a font size of 14 pixels. Maybe we want to set the background color yellow, but anything that we attach that happy class to is going to have those attributes or have those features. ID and class, as mentioned previously, are both universal attributes. So ID is for unique elements, such as you're a unique individual, and so you would probably have an ID if we use them for humans. And then classes are used to categorize elements into groups, right? Just as we mentioned before, if you belong to a class, maybe you're taking Philosophy 101, that would be the class that would be used to describe you. One of the many, probably. All right. Last and not least, we want to talk a little bit about comments. You can add comments to your CSS file to explain what it does. It's going to make your code a little bit easier for others to read and understand. There are two different types of comments that you can add. You can add multi-line and also single line. They both start with a / and an asterisk, and then end with an asterisk and then a /, right? Anything that's between those characters won't be interpreted by a browser. And so you have our multi-line comments up here, and then also our single line comments down here. The only difference is that one takes up one line, and then the other multi-line takes up multiple lines. All right. Fonts and font families. This is one of my favorites because I think that fonts are really critical when we're stylizing a website. Good font can make a huge difference. You want things to be simple and clean, especially on a mobile device. It makes it a lot easier to read. Typically want to stray away from decorative fonts for really small screens. There's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into fonts and just sort of the general field of typography. So a font is just a set of characters of a particular size and style. The primary way to specify fonts in CSS is just using the font family property, right, within a declaration. And there are three common types of fonts that you're going to see, and that will be tested on the HTML app development exam, right? We've got serif, sans serif, and then monospace. So serif is I guess an example of serif font is Times New Roman, and you can see that there are little decorations on the edges of the letter. I can't circle it because my fingers are too fat, so I apologize. But you can see there with the N, right? You have a couple of different decorations. Same thing with the R too. With sans serif, an example is Arial, and notice that there is no decoration. Like, these are super clean lines, right? Unlike the ones that I'm drawing on the screen. And then finally, you have monospace. An example is Courier. We're also using another one, it's Consolas, which is in the in Web Matrix. You'll see it featured throughout our presentations, right? But each of these letters occupies the same amount of space. So it doesn't matter if it's a capital R or a lowercase I, they possess the same width, right? They occupy the same amount of screen space. All right, sometimes you're gonna wanna go ahead and import a font into your web page. And in order to do that, you have to use the @FontFace rule. The @FontFace, excuse me, the @FontFace rule allows developers to use any font as long as it's located on their web server. It used to be the case that we had to use web-safe fonts, but that was basically limited to any fonts that were installed on a user's device. And so if you have all these different devices now, like just tons of smartphones, tons of laptops, tablets, you know, it's kind of a roll of the dice to sort of just make the assumption that somebody's going to possess the font that you want to use on their computer. And so the @FontFace rule is a really fantastic way to be able to access the fonts that you want to use on your website. And here's an example down at the bottom of the screen of how you would implement the @FontFace rule. Use the font family, excuse me, use the font family property, right? Insert the name of the font. And then you want to go ahead and indicate the source of the font that you're using. And that would be in the form of a URL, which is going to just be a link to a web page or happen to be a local file on your computer or on your web server. All right, so let's go ahead and get into the really interesting stuff, like how do we actually style these web pages? Let's talk about content flow, okay? Flow is a display style in HTML that focuses on filling content on a page horizontally in rows. So if I have my two hands, right, and so I'll put them over here so you can see them. If I add an element to a page, it occupies an entire row. If I add a second element to a page, naturally it's going to occupy the second row. They aren't going to automatically sort of appear on the same row, but rather we've got one that's going to sit on top of the other, okay? We can change this using flow with CSS, right? So we have block flow and then we also have inline flow, okay? And actually, let me go ahead and backtrack. I just misspoke a little bit. Not that we use block flow, there is block flow and then there is inline flow as well. So with block flow, you're gonna see block level elements doing exactly what I just did with my hands. And then with inline flow, you've got different content that's going to fit in line with other content. So it maybe you embed an image or something along those lines within a paragraph, and that is going to appear like this little guy right there in our inline flow example there on the right. All right, so let's talk about positioning and how we can change the positioning on a page. Floating elements is the first thing on the list. In addition to modifying the flow of a page, HTML and CSS allow developers to position individual elements where they want them on a page, okay? The float property is going to allow you to move an element all the way to the left or to the right of a page here, just like our blue element, okay? The value of float is commonly going to be set to left or right, okay? I want to go ahead and show you a quick example of this. And just a second, we'll come back to talk about clearing floats. So pardon me, I'm just going to sort of diverge from the course. All right, So I'm going to go ahead and show you here a quick float demo, right? So I've got my HTML text down here, just H1 float demo, right? We've got our header there. And then we've got two divs. I've got one ID'd as block 1, and then the second is ID'd as block 2. The first one is going to appear as a blue block, and I've styled that, and I'll show you that in just a second. And then the second one here is going to appear as a green block. And we're going to go ahead and mess with these two blocks a little bit, okay? Take a look at my style here. I've used the style tags embedded inside of the head element. I've got my divs, both divs, because this applies to all of them, are set to float to the left, okay? Block 1 and block 2, both are a width of 200. The background color is simply blue for block 1 and then green for block 2, just like we had said. And then I added this attribute here, margin. It's going to add a little bit of space around the two blocks so they don't bump into each other too much, okay? So let's go ahead and pop this up on the screen. And having a couple of problems here, but that's not a worry. There we go. All right, so enlarge the font size so you can see, and it actually messed up my demo. But here you have two examples. You have the blue block and the green block. Right now I've got them set to float left, so blue block floats left first, and then green block floats in between. Now right next to it on the right. If I remove the float property, let's go ahead and comment that out actually. I'm just gonna copy this. If I comment that out and I save and I go ahead and I refresh the page, what happens is I have my first block level element is on the top, and then my next block level element is on the bottom, just like I had shown you earlier with my hands, okay? Super important to keep in mind. Now I'm gonna go ahead and remove these comments, and we'll go back to our presentation to talk about clearing. So sometimes you're going to float an element to the left or to the right, and you aren't going to want other floating elements to touch the left or the right-hand sides of an element. And in order to make that happen, in order to clear the left or the right, we're going to use the clear property. And we set the value as left, right, both, or none. So left is going to clear the left side, right is going to clear the right side, both clears both sides. Pretty self-explanatory, okay? Here in this example, we've cleared the left side for the element that's surrounded by the broken border, okay? All right, so we go back to Web Matrix, and I am going to take box 2, I'm going to delete these comments, and I'm going to add the clear left property here, okay? So I go back to my float demo, and I'm going to go ahead and hit right, and notice that we still have everything set as float left, but we still see both of the elements appearing as block level elements, right? And that's because for element 2, for block 2, I've gone ahead and I've cleared the left side of that element. All right, moving on. So let's talk about positioning, okay? You can position elements at specific points on a page using the position property. We've got a couple of different ways to do that. You can change the position property as make it static. You can make it relative, absolute, or fixed. Static is going to just simply position an element with its normal flow, just like you saw the boxes without any modification. Relative is going to position an element in relation to where it would normally be positioned in the flow of content. And I'll show you what that means here in just a second. Absolute ensures that the positioning of an element doesn't impact any other content at all. And then fixed places it in relation to the browser window, and it stays in the same place the entire time. I'm actually going to exit out of my presentation here, and we're going to go to Bing. I'm just going to do a really quick search here for, early human species found. That's exciting. Going to do a quick search for CSS position property. You can find a lot of great tutorials on W3 Schools, and I'm actually going to go ahead and just resize this window real fast. So if we go back to our presentation here, we'll take a look at static first, okay? So if I take a look at a static element here, you can see that no matter where it's at on the page, it's going to just stay in its same order. Absolute, however, this div is positioned exactly where, exactly where it's supposed to be. So you see that it's positioned to the left, or from the left of the window by 10 pixels, and from the top, and this right here is being the window, okay? Now, if we look at relative, we've positioned it relative on the position of the screen. And then initial is something that we didn't talk about, and it won't actually be tested on the exam. All right, so let's head back to the presentation. And finally, we're going to talk about content overflow, okay? And this is one of my favorite ones to talk about because HTML is actually inside of something called a bounding box, right? So every single element occupies a rectangular space called a bounding box. And so you can think of text with a highlighted background on a Word document or a page as like being a bounding box, right? Where the highlighting stops is where the bounding box ends. And with CSS, you can modify the height or width of the bounding box, and if an element, or rather the content of an element, doesn't fit inside of it, then that content is called overflow. You can modify how the overflow is treated by using the overflow property in CSS. And here, we've actually set the overflow to something called visible. And I'll show you that here in just a second. First and foremost, though, let's talk about scrolling overflow, right? So sometimes you go ahead and you set all the content inside of a box, you have a ton of content that won't fit inside of your defined box, right? That content either goes nowhere, it overflows outside of the box, or you can set the overflow property to scroll, which creates a scrolling box as featured here in this right side of the window, okay? With visible overflow, you have the content goes outside of this light gray box and overflows. If it's hidden, then all of a sudden the content gets truncated and is completely cut off. And I'll actually just go ahead and show you all these different overflow values in the same demo. And I apologize, I forgot that I was going to do that. I set it up so that you guys can go ahead and copy all my CSS code here, and then go ahead and add go ahead and eliminate the other two that you don't want to demo yourself. But let's go ahead and go back to Web Matrix. And let's take a look at our overflow demo. All right, so I have a bunch of content here that I'll show you. I just have the lorem ipsum text, and you guys can just go ahead and do a quick Bing search for lorem ipsum, and you can just write text afterwards, and you can find all of this stuff. And it's great for being able to do a lot of web testing and just sort of honing your skills and sharpening your skills. So keep that in mind. But notice here that I've set it to scroll. And first, I'm going to cut that for a second so you guys can see what this looks like without any modification. So I'm going to launch this in the browser. So here it overflows, right? So it's visible as a default. So I'm going to come back here and I'm going to change the overflow property to scroll. So now I'm going to come back to Internet Explorer. I'm going to hit refresh, and all of a sudden I have a scroll box, which is pretty darn cool. Now, let's go ahead and set it to visible. Once again, we already saw that because that's the default setting for the overflow property, right? Looks exactly as we had seen before. And then now we're going to go ahead and set it to hidden. Refresh the page, and all of a sudden, it's hidden. So it's pretty quick and easy to handle overflow. It's really important that you make sure to do that, because there'd be nothing more frustrating as a user than going and reading an article and seeing that the text is cut off. That'd be a pretty big nuisance, right? So keep that in mind. It's also a great way to go ahead and contain the, excuse me, manage the size of a bounding box and add scrolling as a feature in order to make sure that an article doesn't go too long on a page, or that somebody doesn't have to scroll forever on a web page, right? You can just take a look at a section inside of a page and scroll through that just as easily as you would an entire web page. So keep that in mind. All right. So we're at the end of Module 4. As a quick recap for Objective 3.1, understanding the core CSS concepts, we talked about cascading style sheets, selectors and declarations, fonts and font families, content flow, positioning, and then content overflow. Thanks. It was great having you. I'll see you again in Module 5.